Maury, what question is next?
All right, up next is this one's a pretty deep one. So, D-Rock asks, WoW was supposed to be a Warhammer MMO. Yeah. They went with 40k, but it was actually just meant to be fantasy. But let's go ahead and go on with the...
Yeah.
Let's just assume it was meant to be 40k, because that's the only way the question makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Their question is Sargeras the Horus of WoW, as Horus was the champion of the Primarchs, such that Sargeras is the champion of the Pantheon that fell to corruption.
Yeah.
If that's the same mirror, does it make sense that Azeroth would be the Emperor, since Azeroth is kind of in this sort of vegetable-like state, but still whispers to different beings?
Yeah.
And then further, they question, would that make the first ones the WoW version of the old ones?
All right. Trying to think how to formulate my answer here. So first things first, let's get a couple of things straight. It's not WoW specifically that was meant to be Warhammer. It's Warcraft that was meant to be Warhammer. It was, they didn't get the license for Warhammer when they were making Warcraft 1. I believe at the time it was a bit too expensive for them. And then when they wanted to make World of Warhammer, so they made the Warcraft stuff, right? So they already had Warcraft done and dusted. The games existed. Now they wanted to make an MMO. They had this idea for making an MMO, and they thought, let's make an MMO in the Warhammer universe. We already have the Warhammer-esque stuff with Warcraft, because Warcraft is very closely related to Warhammer. So World of Warhammer wouldn't be too big of a stretch. We could probably bring a lot of those players from Warcraft into World of Warhammer. Let's just call it that, even though I don't think that would have been the working title. Or the official title, at least. But, so, it's in that portion. So when they were trying to get the license for World of Warhammer, that the company, what are they called again? Oh my god, I keep forgetting.
Games Workshop.
No, not Games Workshop. Games Workshop awarded the license to... It's not Epic
Mythic Entertainment.
Mythic Entertainment. There you go. Thank you. So they awarded the license to Mythic Entertainment instead of giving it to Blizzard. And this is where Blizzard then had to pivot and sort of make the MMO about Warcraft rather than about Warhammer, even though that is what they wanted to do originally. So that's sort of the fullness of the backstory, just so that we get that clear. People seem to, as soon as you say that, you know, World of Warcraft came from Warhammer, people seem to think that World of Warcraft or Warcraft is Warhammer. And that's when you start to get that, oh, so does that mean Sargeras is actually Horus? And, is it true then also that Illidan is in fact Abaddon? No. These games inspired each other. So Warcraft is heavily Warhammer inspired, which means Chris Metzen wanted to create a world of the same scale and of the same depth as Warhammer. He wanted to have that incredible fantasy that is Warhammer. It doesn't mean that he copied things pound for pound, but he definitely took inspiration. So a great example of this in World of Warcraft that doesn't have anything to do with Warhammer is the Old Gods. The Old Gods in World of Warcraft is incredibly heavily inspired by H.P. Lovecraft's Outer Gods and Old Ones. Okay? Now, they're not pound for pound copied from H.P. Lovecraft. They're similar. So they share similarities between each other, but they're not copied pound for pound. Cthulhu, for example, N'Zoth is incredibly inspired by Cthulhu. But Cthulhu has a number of things that he does that N'Zoth does not do. In fact, Cthulhu, you have to take all of the qualities of Cthulhu, put them together, and then you sort of get all of the old gods. Because they did sort of take Cthulhu and they split Cthulhu into 4 entities in order to sort of make up the old gods. So these are inspirations that's taken. Which means when you look at Warhammer and you look at World of Warcraft, you can look at things like the Void and probably things like the Twisting Nether, and it will have very close relation to something like the Warp, because it was inspired by it. Chris Metzen also wanted this realm that was chaotic, that was scary, that could breed monsters that would keep you, like, wake you up screaming at night. And so Chris Metzen designed the Twisting Nether and the Void to be sort of the warp of Warcraft. It isn't the warp, it doesn't function the exact same way as the warp, but it's closely related to it. So it's difficult to answer questions like, would this mean that this is this? No, probably not. Azeroth isn't the Emperor. Azeroth's story and the Emperor's story isn't the same. But there are similarities between Azeroth's story and the Emperor's story, although those similarities exist currently only in speculation. So, for example, the Emperor is a prisoner of the Golden Throne. I don't care what anyone fucking says. You can say as much as you want. He is a prisoner. He can't fucking leave, and the humans put him there. They're keeping him alive, rotting as he sits there. Azeroth is locked up on Azeroth. She can't leave. She can't get out. That's our speculation for it. In that sense, they are the same, but they might be completely different in every other way. And here's the really bad news for everyone that loves the Warhammer universe and also happens to love World of Warcraft. I do not think Steve the Newser is a fan of Warhammer. In fact, I'm willing to bet good money that Steve the Newser isn't a fan of Warhammer. The Warhammer universe is way too dark, way too dank for Steve the Newser to get into it. I don't see it. Moni, do you? Do you think Steve the Newser is a massive Warhammer fanboy?
No, and the way I can tell you that is he thinks that Season 8 of Game of Thrones was the pinnacle of Game of Thrones. And by that alone, I can judge the man's tastes. And you're absolutely right. Warhammer is way too grimdark. There is no... There are no heroes. The heroes are whoever you make of them. Yeah. Because the characters in Warhammer do as much good as they do bad. Yeah. They're stuck in this chaotic existence that they just have to do the best that they can. And there are no, like, goody-goodies at all. And that's what Steve is trying to do with Warcraft, is specifically put, basically draw lines in the sand on what characters are good and what characters are evil.
I mean, if you, again, just to sort of in the spirit of the question, because Moni, you just reminded me of something there. The earliest versions of World of Warcraft were so very similar to that of Warhammer. The Alliance and the Horde were meant to be set up in this exact way. Neither good, neither evil. Right? They're not good or evil. They are Horde and Alliance. They are both.
I mean, when they still were going to be a Warhammer IP, like the second that they lost the licensing to it, Metzen had to come up with a reason for why his orcs were green, as opposed to just, well, in Warhammer, orcs are green. You don't question that. They just are, because one of their names is literally greenskins.
Yeah.
But once he lost the licensing to that, he suddenly had to come up with his own lore reason for that. And that started him down the whole trail of the blood of Manaroth, and probably built a lot of the Legion's lore as we know it today.
Oh, I mean, obviously, because he decided to make the orcs green because they drink demon blood. Interesting enough, those orcs also borrowed quite a lot from old school Warhammer, insofar as the orcs that drank demon blood were war hungry. They saw only war, and that's all they wanted to fucking do. It was just war. That's it, right? They just wanted to fight fucking everything and anything in their path. They were the ultimate conquerors because they felt no fear. They could not care less. They just wanted to fight. That is why one of their famous sayings is blood and honor, right? Victory or death. That's all they care about. But they were never set up to be evil or good. They were just who they were. And
a force of nature.
Yeah, good or evil would depend on which faction you chose. If you chose the Alliance, you look at the Horde and you think evil fucking scumbag filth. If you chose the Horde, you look at the Alliance and you think evil fucking scumbag filth. It was a matter of perspective, and it was masterfully written to always maintain that matter of perspective, where both sides would be equally good, but also equally bad. Both sides would have those split the audience moments, where, for example, the orcs came to Azeroth and absolutely slaughtered thousands in their conquest. Then the orcs were defeated because they were betrayed. And instead, the humans now start hunting down the orcs and slaughtering every man, woman, and child they can find of the orcs. So much so that the orcs then flee to Kalimdor. They arrive in Kalimdor and they find these forests and they decide to chop down the trees in order to build themselves a home, a city that they can now call their own. They didn't know the Night Elves at this point. They had no idea that they were chopping down the forests of the Night Elves. The Night Elves arrive, see these fucking green assholes chopping down their trees, and nearly genocide the orcs. Right? They fucking destroyed the orcs because the Night Elves had magic. The Night Elves were far more organized. There were far more of them. So every side has good stories, heroic stories about them, and every side has incredibly dark stories about them. The humans, for example, kept the orcs in slave camps and prisoner camps where they would make these orcs fight. The orcs did the same thing to the humans that they caught. So there's a lot of back and forth of good versus evil. And so every side has their biases. And that's how it was supposed to be written. Not anymore, though. Yeah?
Yeah, the other source of inspiration that a lot of people forget for Metzen was Dungeons and Dragons.
True.
And the same can be said of the Warhammer IP folks. But to be honest, once the Warhammer thing fell through, he fell heavily on his D&D inspiration and started building something that was reminiscent, but wholly his own.
I agree with you.
I mean, heck, now he's making his own D&D setting in Oribos or whatever.
True. Ouroboros, I think, is what they're calling it.
Yeah, thank you.
Right? War Chief Games, Ouroboros. I mean, at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is tropes. And that is what this is. It's using fantasy tropes, common fantasy tropes, in order to appeal to an audience. And we know that there are only certain tropes that really work. And so, yes, Chris Metzen went to the two most successful fantasy universes in the world, excluding Lord of the Rings. Because if Warhammer and D&D are successful, they owe all of their success to Lord of the Rings. Because if it wasn't for Lord of the Rings,
agree.
There would be no fantasy. Like, Lord of the Rings is the inspiration for almost all fantasy in the modern era. Okay? But then Chris Metzen comes along and he says, right, I need to borrow from these because it works. People obviously love it. And you can see the difference. I'm gonna take a bit of time here and just sort of, if you go and you look at World of Warcraft videos, the majority of World of Warcraft videos, right? And I'm not talking about my videos. I'm talking about top World of Warcraft content creators. They get between, let's say, 80,000 and 200,000 views per video. Let's say that someone like Noble, with once a month video releases, maybe twice a month, he can sometimes get a 250, maybe a 500k viewer video. And then I go on Warhammer and I look at Luton's videos, I look at Bricky's videos, even Major Kill's videos. You don't find a video from the top content creators in Warhammer with under 300k views. That universe is fucking massive. World of Warcraft could have been that if they stuck to the Grimdark. Because I think that is what pulled people in. That is what people want. They want that darkness. They don't want the Hollywood, let's make everything good and holy. They want the sort of fuck you, right? Fuck you and your sister. Let's go. It's kind of... And to think, mere months ago, I had no idea what Warhammer even was. Couldn't care less.
Well, I mean, you as far as like fantasy or even sci-fi goes, you have kind of like two different viewpoints that you just pointed out. You have grimdark, harsh reality, apocalyptic madness, which is basically 40k.
Yeah.
And to an extent, Warhammer Fantasy too, because it's the same thing. There are no good people. There are no bad people.
Yeah.
Or at least good and bad are what you make of it.
Yeah, it's relative.
But then exactly, and then you have the opposite end of the spectrum. If you want a good guy versus bad guy story, Lord of the Rings, Tolkien.
Yeah.
It is the quintessential good guys versus bad guys, good guys win.
True. I mean, again, you can do it. I just think World of Warcraft is going the wrong way. And I think specifically in the modern era, I think Grimdark, the world is fucked. Everyone knows the world is fucked. Why would we want to play games that pretend it isn't? I want to play Warhammer. Why? Because it's preparing me for what is coming.
It is very cathartic in that sense, right? Like, shit's going to hell. We might as well just embrace this. I mean, it's why all of those Mad Max movies are going to always make money, because any kind of post-apocalypse scenario is just like, okay, let's embrace this and see what happens.
True. But I mean, fuck it. Let's see. But no, to end the question, I really hope people will stop like trying to make one-on-one comparisons, because I don't think you can. I don't think those universes are that closely related to one another. They're close, but not that close.
Yeah, no, they're very different. Yesterday I was at my local game store because I had to pick up some new brushes, because I'm very hard on my paint brushes. And I had a rather long conversation with the owner of the shop about how within Games Workshop themselves, they've even carved out these own little fiefdoms where even comparing between Warhammer 40k and what fantasy turned into, which is Age of Sigmar, is in itself a futile gesture too.
Yeah.
When Warhammer Fantasy was still around, and it, for those of you who don't know, it is coming back. It's just gonna take a while. But when Fantasy was around, there was a little bit more comparison between 40k and Fantasy. Like, you were able to make those equates more easier.
Yeah.
Because there were also these theories that the fans came up that GW was like, yeah, sure, we'll let those exist, that said things like, Sigmar in Warhammer Fantasy was one of the lost Primarchs, or he was a shard of the Emperor when the Emperor was wounded by Horus.
Yeah.
Or that the Warhammer Fantasy is a planet inside the Eye of Terror, and that's why it's separated from everything, because nothing can get to the middle of that giant warp storm.
And I'm assuming I'm assuming the Warhammer fanboys do not like that.
It depends on who you ask. Like, there are some people that loved the connection between the two. Like myself and Alpaca, we go on and on about the different comparisons between Fantasy and 40k, how there are analogs to them. Yeah. And then, even though he absolutely hates Age of Sigmar, and that's my tabletop hobby, is Age of Sigmar, and I like the lore of it, I also acknowledge that the lore for Age of Sigmar is just wonky. It's crazy. Like, they went from the typical style of fantasy is Tolkien or Dungeons and Dragons. Like, whenever you say fantasy, that's what it invokes. You're thinking Lord of the Rings or D&D, right? Games Workshop, their stuff is more high fantasy. Like, even when they did regular fantasy tropes, they still did it with a touch of high fantasy, one step above.
Yeah.
And then when they got rid of Warhammer Fantasy and moved into Age of Sigmar, they were like, what if we just crank this to 11? And then you get things like these elves that live under the oceans that actually bind beasts like sharks and giant sea turtles to their will.
Yeah.
And crazy shit like that.
Hey, I'm all for high fantasy. I like high fantasy. Final Fantasy does this really well, you know, the super high fantasy stuff. I personally, if I'm gonna be honest, I like the fact that Games Workshop split the two universes and keeps them split. Not because I dislike fantasy or love or dislike 40k. I just think linking the two would have created a limited story for at least one of them. Right?
Yeah, they'd be forever tied, and you couldn't grow with either of them.
So think about this. You could do with Warhammer Fantasy, you could do where it is Terra long before the Emperor. So very long before the Emperor. That is Terra, right? So it is the history of Terra before the Emperor was born. Okay, cool. No problem. You could even have Sigmar there because the Emperor technically was around since the beginning days. So, you know, the Emperor was Sigmar. He came to help the humans and then he left again. And then he only came back in the 40k universe. But now you're stuck. Because the natural end of 40k, of fantasy, is always going to be where 40k starts. There's no other way around it because you've made it the history of 40k. Okay, so you can't do that because you're limited in what you're allowed to do, especially since 40k introduces the introduction to the Xenos races and things like that. You can't do any of the Xenos races, right? You just can't, right? Even if you try to change some of the lore, because, well, humans only encountered the Xenos races later. Okay, so that's out of the fucking question. Ormi, I know, I'm talking about you do a couple of rewrites in order to make it canon that, you know, fantasy is the origins of 40k. Okay, so let's go with fantasy in the Eye of Terror. Well, you're again limited. Because, first and foremost, the universe cannot span beyond the Eye of Terror, because then you start bleeding into the 40k universe. You can also not do anything that is going to conflict with anything that is in 40k. So everything is going to go exactly the way that it goes in 40k. So there's no real good way of linking those two universes without limiting one of the two universes in a miserable way for almost everyone. So I like the fact that they're split so that each of these stories can become and do their own thing. But there's enough similarity that you're not really asked to learn everything from scratch. So, for example, with the Chaos Gods, they're kind of the same.
Yeah, I was actually waiting for you to bring that up, because I was going to say the only thing that those two settings share is the Chaos Gods, because that's like the one. That's kind of the one fundamental thing that separates GW from other fantasy and sci-fi genres. Is they have these 4 elemental beings, the Chaos Gods, and everything else invariably revolves around them.
Yeah.
Like they are kind of the big players. There are other people that are, interacting with them too, but the big 4 are the big players in that great game.
Yeah. And that I like, right? There's a little bit of overlap, but enough freedom to take your story wherever the fuck you want to take it without having to worry about it. So that I like. Anyways, it's a great fucking question. I really appreciate that. So thank you so much for that.